In July of 2016, 17-year-old Mike Mansholt suddenly disappeared while exploring ancient catacombs on the island of Malta. 5 days later, his body was found at the base of a cliff, and investigators initially believed he had died in a fall, but the autopsy revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Despite the apparent fall, he had no broken bones, and examiners found that his internal organs were missing, removed through a large opening in the abdomen. Authorities were never able to explain how the organs were removed or what happened to them, leaving the circumstances of his death deeply unsettling and unresolved. Rappe-kun was a Humboldt penguin at the Tobu Zoo in Japan, whose longtime mate Midori eventually left him for a younger penguin, leaving him largely isolated from the rest of the colony. But in 2017, the zoo placed cardboard cutouts of characters from the anime Kimono Zoo around the park, including one of Hululu, an anthropomorphic Humboldt penguin, inside his enclosure. Visitors soon noticed Rappe-kun repeatedly standing next to the cutout for long periods, and even displaying what appeared to be courtship behavior toward it. Photos of the unusual bond soon went viral online, and the zoo eventually decided to leave the cutout inside the enclosure for him. Rappe-kun died a few months later at about 21 years old, with the cardboard character still standing by his side. On March 4th, 1994, beloved comedian John Candy died of a heart attack at the young age of 43 while filming for Wagons East in Durango, Mexico. Candy long feared he would suffer the same fate as his father, who had also died of a heart attack at a young age. After years of struggling with weight issues, heavy smoking, and earlier drug use, Candy died in his sleep in the middle of production for the film. His death stunned Hollywood, and he was so beloved that when his body was returned to Los Angeles, police took the extraordinary step of shutting down the notoriously busy 405 freeway so his funeral procession could pass uninterrupted, a tribute typically preserved for presidents and other heads of state. On September 24, 2005, Mark Dixie spent his 35th birthday drinking at a pub in London before walking the streets with a knife. In the early hours of the morning, he followed 18-year-old Sally Bowman as she returned home and stabbed her repeatedly outside her own front door. Her body was discovered just steps from safety. Dixie evaded arrest for 9 months until he was involved in an unrelated pub fight, and his DNA was entered into the national database, where it directly matched evidence from the murder scene. In 2006, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. In December of 2025, a judge in Arkansas awarded joint custody of 6-year-old twins Eliana and Maverick Bialis to their father, Dr. Randy Bialis, after a full-day divorce hearing. Their mother, 40-year-old Charity Bialis, had represented herself in court and failed to convince the judge that Randy was abusive, despite the fact that earlier that year he admitted to strangling her in front of the children and pleaded guilty to third-degree battery, receiving a suspended sentence. Less than 24 hours after the custody ruling, deputies entered Charity's home after concerns were raised about the family. Inside, they found Charity and both twins dead to gunshot wounds. Investigators determined the home alarm had been deactivated from Charity's phone around 10 p.m. There were no signs of forced entry, and Randy's phone and vehicle records showed he was nowhere near the house. Authorities ultimately concluded that Charity shot Eliana and Maverick before turning the gun on herself, just days before she was scheduled to hand the children over to her ex-husband. July of 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese climbed out of her bedroom window after midnight to meet her two closest friends, 16-year-old Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, believing they were going for a fun late-night drive. But instead, they crossed into a secluded wooded area in Pennsylvania, put on hoodies and gloves they had brought with them, counted to 3, and stabbed her more than 50 times in what prosecutors described as a premeditated attack. Investigators later revealed the motive was disturbingly simple. Schoaf said they didn't like her anymore and didn't want to be friends. For months after her disappearance, both girls publicly mourned her on social media, posting heartfelt tributes while knowing exactly where her body was. The case unraveled when Schoaf finally confessed and led authorities to Skylar's remains. She was sentenced to 30 years to life and was eligible for parole in 2023, but remains incarcerated after being denied release. Sheila Eddy received a life sentence and becomes eligible for parole in 2028. In 2006, the burned remains of an unidentified young woman were found along a Texas roadside, leaving her known only as Lavender Doe for years because of the purple clothing she was wearing. The case sat cold for years until an amateur sleuth began comparing online Jane Doe files and helped spark renewed attention that led to advanced DNA testing. In 2019, she was finally identified as Dana Lynn Todd, restoring her name after 13 years. In 2023, Joseph Burnett pleaded guilty to her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 14-year-old Mexican girl Paloma Nicole Arellano died after undergoing cosmetic surgery that reportedly included breast augmentation and a Brazilian butt lift at a private clinic allegedly run by her mother's boyfriend. Authorities said she suffered severe complications following the procedure and was placed in a medically induced coma but died a few days later. Prosecutors later confirmed that the man accused of performing the procedure was arrested and charged in connection with her death, including allegations tied to practicing medicine without proper authorization. Between 2014 and 2015, Ohio woman Brittany Pilkington was responsible for the deaths of 3 of her children, all infant sons, over a 13-month span. The first child's death was initially ruled a case of SIDS, but suspicions grew after a second infant died under similar circumstances. Doctors briefly considered a possible genetic condition, and despite investigations, the youngest boy was returned home only to also die a few days later. One of her children, the only daughter, was never harmed. In police questioning, Brittany confessed to deliberately smothering all 3. She described restraining the older one by holding his legs during the struggle until he went limp after a few minutes. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a long history of trauma surrounding the family. Brittany was repeatedly beaten by her biological father as a child, and even worse, her husband was her former stepfather, whom she said had groomed and sexually abused her starting at the age of 9 before she eventually married him as a teenager. In 2018, she pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vern Troyer lived with a rare genetic condition called cartilage hair hypoplasia, which left him just 2 feet 8 inches tall and caused lifelong medical complications. Despite worldwide fame as Mini-Me, he struggled for years with severe depression and alcohol dependency, leading to repeated hospitalizations and psychiatric interventions. In April of 2018, Troyer was hospitalized following a serious health crisis related to alcohol and died shortly after at the age of 48. Authorities later confirmed his passing was intentional, highlighting the long-term toll of his mental health struggles behind the scenes of his public success. In 2022, a 19-year-old woman in Brazil gave birth to twins who were later confirmed by DNA testing to have different fathers. The rare biological phenomenon behind this is called heteropaternal superfecundation, which occurs when 2 eggs released during the same ovulation cycle are fertilized by sperm from different men within a short window of time. Although the twins develop together in the womb and are born at the same time, they're genetically half-siblings. Fewer than a few dozen confirmed cases have been documented worldwide, making it one of the rarest known anomalies in human reproduction. In August of 2023, 73-year-old Roger Leadbeater was taking his usual evening walk with his rescue dog Max through a quiet park in Sheffield when he was suddenly hunted and murdered in one of the most savage random attacks in UK history. Security footage later showed 32-year-old Emma Boroway, a schizophrenic patient who had escaped from a psychiatric unit 2 days earlier, pacing around the park and hiding in the bushes before ambushing him. She stabbed Roger more than 50 times, including through the eye and repeatedly in the back as he tried to crawl away, inflicting a total of 124 separate injuries. His hands, arms, and legs were covered in defensive wounds, showing he fought desperately until he collapsed and died on the ground. When his family returned days later to leave flowers in the spot he died, they found the scene still covered in his blood, with the outline of his body visible and dog prints stamped around it. Emma later told police the devil had tricked her and called the killing a ritual sacrifice. She had previously killed animals, threatened staff, and repeatedly escaped custody. 4 months after being charged with Roger's murder, she took her own life in prison, while an inquest ruled his death was caused by catastrophic failures in mental health supervision. In November of 1998, 48-year-old Harold Brady used a church meeting to gain the trust of Chandel Maycock and her 5-year-old daughter Quatisha before abducting them in Florida. He first drove Chandel to an isolated sugar field, wrapped his hands around her throat, and strangled her until her body went limp. Believing she was dead, he left her lying alone in the field, but she later woke up severely injured and barely survived after flagging down a passing driver. Brady then took Quatisha deep into the Everglades and abandoned her alive near a canal locals refer to as Alligator Alley. Prosecutors say he left her there deliberately, believing the child could identify him. The 5-year-old was left alone in the dark wetlands, surrounded by predators, unable to escape or call for help. 2 days later, her body was recovered from the canal, with investigators concluding she was torn apart by alligators. Brady was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but decades later, changes to Florida's death penalty laws reopened his case. More than 25 years after the crime, prosecutors are now seeking his execution. Renowned actress Natalie Wood died in November of 1981 at age 43 after drowning off the coast of California during a weekend boat trip with her husband Robert Wagner and co-star Christopher Walken. She had gone missing from their yacht yacht Splendor sometime during the night and was later found floating in the water wearing a nightgown, socks, and a down jacket. The initial investigation ruled her death an accidental drowning, suggesting she had slipped while trying to secure a loose dinghy, despite Wood's well-known fear of dark water and inability to swim. An autopsy revealed bruises on her body and the presence of alcohol and pain medication, raising questions about whether she was impaired or injured before entering the water. Conflicting accounts from Wagner and Walken, reports of a heated argument earlier that night, and later statements from the boat's captain alleging Wagner delayed calling for help fueled decades of suspicion. 30 years later, in 2011, authorities officially reopened the case, and in 2012, Wood's death certificate was amended to drowning and other undetermined factors. In 2018, Wagner was named a person of interest, though no official charges have ever been filed, leaving one of Hollywood's most infamous deaths officially unresolved. In October of 2024 in Arizona, 9-year-old Rebecca Baptiste escaped her home by jumping out a second-story apartment window and running to a nearby gas station, where she begged strangers for help and said she was being abused by her father and his girlfriend. Police and child welfare authorities were notified, and hospital staff documented visible injuries, but officers ultimately downplayed her claims and returned her to her abusers. Over the following months, the abuse escalated until July of 2025, when Rebecca was found unresponsive along a rural highway and later died from non-accidental trauma. An autopsy revealed extreme malnourishment, extensive bruising, burns, hair loss, and other injuries consistent with prolonged torture. Her father, Richard Baptiste, and his girlfriend, Anisha Woods, were arrested and charged with murder and severe child abuse, as the case became a stark example of how a child's desperate pleas for help were ignored with fatal consequences. For years, rumors circulated that prostitutes who went to a pig farm outside of Vancouver never came back. That's because Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton was murdering them on his property. From the late 1980s to the early 2000s, dozens disappeared after being lured there, where they were killed, dismembered, and fed to the pigs. DNA from multiple victims was later found scattered across the farm, and in 2007, Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life, though prosecutors argued he killed at least 26 women. According to court records and police testimony, Pickton told an undercover police officer posing as a cellmate that he had killed 49 women and was upset he was caught right before making it to 50. Benjamin Guggenheim was a wealthy American industrialist traveling aboard the Titanic in 1912. As the ship sank, he refused a lifeboat, insisting that women and children go first. He reportedly changed into evening clothes with his valet and prepared to die on board the ship. Before disappearing below deck, Guggenheim is said to have asked a survivor to tell his family that he, quote, played the game straight to the end and that no woman or child was left behind because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. His body was never recovered. On June 5, 1986, 24-year-old New York City model Marla Hansen was asked by her landlord Stephen Roth to meet outside a Manhattan bar to collect an $850 security deposit he owed her. As they walked away, Hansen was ambushed by 2 men Roth had hired. One attacker restrained her head while the other slashed her face with razor blades, carving deep wounds across her cheeks as Roth stood by and watched. The attack required more than 150 stitches, leaving her with permanent disfigurement that effectively ended her modeling career. Hansen survived after extensive reconstructive surgery, and investigators later determined that Roth had ordered the attack after she rejected his romantic advances. He and the 2 attackers were convicted and sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Hansen said the trauma continued in court, where a defense attorney subjected her to a vicious and humiliating cross-examination, attacking her credibility, accusing her of manipulating men, and suggested she had falsely identified her attackers due to her being racist, an experience she described as worse than the physical attack itself. This woman's crimes were so horrific that she became the first female in the history of France to receive a full life sentence. In 2022, 12-year-old Lola Davier disappeared after school in Paris, and security footage from the apartment building where she lived with her family showed her walking inside with 27-year-old Dabia Ben-Kirid following closely behind. Hours later, Lola's body was found stuffed inside a plastic storage box in the lobby of that same building. Investigators say Ben-Kirid lured the girl into her own sister's apartment, who lived upstairs, where she forced Lola to shower, taped her face, stabbed her repeatedly, and subjected her to what the judge called true torture, ultimately killing her through asphyxiation before eventually decapitating her. Ben-Kirid initially confessed, then kept changing her story, and even showed complete indifference when confronted with photos of the gruesome crime. In 2025, she became the first woman in French history to receive a whole life sentence, a punishment previously reserved for only 4 men. The tragedy deepened when Lola's father died in 2024 from alcohol-related complications brought on by the grief of losing his daughter. Donald Glover has revealed that he secretly suffered a stroke while on tour in 2024, collapsing with severe head pain and blurred vision before doctors in Houston told him what had happened. Medical scans then uncovered something even more horrifying, a hidden hole in his heart that required multiple surgeries, while he was also dealing with a broken foot and crushing exhaustion. The combination led to a cascade of health failures that didn't just threaten his tour, they nearly killed him. After months of treatment and recovery, Glover says he's stable now and finally healthy again. In 2002, 21-year-old Angela Walker and her brother attacked 32-year-old Canadian tourist Derek Rogers on a beach in Maine, reportedly knocking him unconscious and stuffing sand into his airways until he suffocated. Walker later lied to police about what had happened, before pleading guilty to manslaughter and perjury and receiving 10 years in prison. More than 2 decades later, in 2025, she was elected to the Bangor City Council, an outcome that drew outrage from the Rogers family and revived public attention towards the brutal killing. An elementary school outing in British Columbia turned into absolute chaos on November 20th, 2025, when a grizzly bear suddenly charged a group of 4th and 5th graders from a wall to school as they paused on a riverside trail. 11 people were injured during the attack, including 2 children who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while 7 others were treated at the scene. Teachers fought the bear off with bear spray and a bear banger, likely preventing multiple deaths. The bear soon escaped back into the forest and has still not been found, and officials say they don't know what triggered the attack or whether the animal will strike again. What's especially unsettling is that the attack happened to a group large enough that grizzlies normally avoid entirely, suggesting something was deeply wrong with the monstrous animal. And until conservation officers track it down, the entire valley remains on edge, knowing an injured and unpredictable grizzly bear is still lurking somewhere in the shadows. In 2017, 22-year-old YouTuber Pedro Ruiz III tried to film a stunt where a hardcover encyclopedia would stop a .50 caliber round from a Desert Eagle. He had already tested the trick once before with a smaller gun, giving him the confidence to try it again, this time asking his pregnant girlfriend Mona Lisa Perez to fire from just a foot away. But the .50 cal round tore straight through the encyclopedia and into his chest, killing him instantly as 2 cameras recorded the stunt and their 3-year-old daughter stood nearby. Family members later said they'd warned him these viral stunts would get him killed. Perez pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 180 days in jail, and their unborn son was later named after Pedro. In Tampa, Florida, a long-lost cemetery quietly vanished from records for nearly a century, until a local newspaper traced old land deeds and realized a public housing complex had been built directly on top of it. When archaeologists scanned the ground with radar, they found over 100 graves still buried under the apartment complex in perfectly neat rows. The housing authority later confirmed they wouldn't disturb the bodies. Instead, they began relocating residents and announced plans to turn the land into a memorial park for the forgotten dead. A 29-year-old Florida woman managed to impersonate a registered nurse for months, slipping into a hospital job while using someone else's license number. During that time, she treated more than 4,000 patients, taking vitals, administering medications, and performing procedures she wasn't trained for. Staff only uncovered the truth when she was offered a promotion and her credentials didn't add up. Investigators later learned she'd been working on the floor for far longer than anyone realized, blending in so well that no one questioned her until she tried to move up. She now faces multiple felony charges, while thousands of patients are being notified that the person who cared for them wasn't a nurse at all. At Disney Springs, a bizarre robbery unfolded straight out of a heist movie in September of 2025. A man in full scuba gear swam up to the paddlefish restaurant after midnight, snuck inside, and forced 2 employees to the ground as they were counting cash. He stole over $10,000, then slipped back into the water and vanished beneath the surface, escaping the same way he arrived. When police got there, all they found were wet footprints, discarded dive gear, and 2 shaken employees tied up inside. To this day, the aquatic thief hasn't been identified. In 2012, Florence Welch of Florence and the Machine nearly died from an undiagnosed ectopic pregnancy, which happens when a fertilized egg implants outside the uterus, usually in a fallopian tube, where it can't grow and can rupture suddenly, causing severe internal bleeding. She went on stage while bleeding internally, thinking it was normal pain, and later learned her fallopian tube had ruptured, leaving what doctors described as a Coke can's worth of blood inside her abdomen. She required emergency surgery to remove the tube and stop the internal bleeding. Florence later said it was the closest she's ever come to dying by far. In 2023, 16-year-old Bryce Brooks from Atlanta jumped into the ocean in Pensacola to save 4 younger kids he'd never met who were being pulled out by a strong rip current. He managed to help get them to safety, but the current dragged him under before he could escape. A family friend, 67-year-old Charles Johnson II, rushed in attempting to save Bryce but was also pulled under. The 4 children survived, but Bryce and Charles didn't make it, and both were later honored as heroes for sacrificing their lives to save others.